Clara walked into her house after a night that was supposed to be a brief escape. She had always prided herself on being a loving mother and wife, even if her marriage had started to feel a bit stale. The job she had, however, was a source of excitement. When she first began working with her boss, Thomas, she never imagined their relationship would go beyond professional. But one night, after a long dinner meeting, everything changed. One kiss led to another, and before Clara knew it, she was entangled in a passionate affair with the man who had once been her superior. Clara entered her home, hoping for a quiet evening. The house was still and dark, which felt odd. As she walked into the living room, a sinking feeling hit her gut. There, in front of the laptop, sat her husband, George, along with their 3 children. The screen flickered and Clara's blood ran cold. It was a video of her and Thomas, doing something she could never have imagined would be exposed this way. The betrayal was on full display, and there was no escaping it now. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as her daughter, Lily, who was just 16, stood up. She walked towards her mother with trembling hands, holding out a set of divorce papers. "You're not welcome here anymore," Lily said, tears streaming down her face. "You've ruined everything." George didn't speak. He didn't have to. The pain in his eyes was enough. Their son, Jake, 18, just stared at his mother, disbelief written all over his face. Little Sophie, their 14-year-old, sat beside her brother, quietly sobbing, not understanding why her family was falling apart. Clara felt the floor beneath her shift, and her world collapsed. How could this happen? How could she go from being the woman who was adored by her family to the one they now despised? Her entire life had been a lie, a betrayal so deep it couldn't be undone. And now, her children, the very people she thought she was doing this all for, had turned their backs on her. Clara sat down on the edge of the couch, her body numb from the emotional onslaught. The divorce papers still felt like a weight on her hands, too heavy to hold, but her daughter's words echoed in her mind. "You're not welcome here anymore." Before the chaos of the past few months, Clara had been a proud mother and wife. George, her husband of 18 years, was the type of man who valued loyalty and tradition. Their life was one that many people envied. A beautiful home, 3 kids who seemed to be thriving, and a career that provided Clara with everything she thought she needed. It was supposed to be the American dream, and for a while it was. George, a software engineer, had worked long hours, but Clara had always supported him. She was the loving wife who ensured the home was in perfect order, and she had thrown herself into raising their children, Lily, Jake, and Sophie. But somewhere along the way, their connection had started to fray. George's work consumed him, and Clara's job, which she had once found so fulfilling, started to feel like an escape from her own dissatisfaction. And that's when Thomas entered the picture. Thomas was new to the company where Clara worked. He was smart, charismatic, and, unlike George, he paid attention to her. At first, Clara brushed off his subtle advances. She told herself she was happy with George, and the thought of betraying him never crossed her mind. But over time, Thomas's attention became irresistible. His compliments, his close proximity at work events, the moments they shared over coffee and late-night work sessions. It all led to that fateful night that shattered everything. But Clara didn't just cheat, Because she was unhappy. No, there was something more, a thirst for excitement, something she hadn't felt in years. She was drawn to Thomas's charm, the way he made her feel seen, valued, and desired. It wasn't just physical, it was the validation she had been missing for so long. When they finally crossed the line, she felt a surge of adrenaline, something she hadn't felt in years, and it intoxicated her. What Clara didn't realize, however, was that her actions would have catastrophic consequences. She wasn't the only one feeling neglected. George had his own demons, his own struggles with the relationship, and his own secret that he'd been hiding for months. George wasn't just a devoted husband. He was a man who had watched his wife slip away from him without knowing how to reach her. And, as Clara would soon find out, George had been trying to save their marriage in a way she hadn't expected. George sat silently in the living room, watching Clara as she cried. His heart ached, not just for the betrayal she had caused him, but for the children, whose world had just been ripped apart. He could see the shock in their eyes as they watched the video of their mother's infidelity. But he also saw something else, the quiet understanding that something had been wrong for a long time. The cracks in their family were now exposed, and there was no going back. But George's pain ran deeper than Clara could have ever imagined. For months, he had noticed the changes in her. The late nights at work, the phone calls that she would quickly end when he entered the room, the long hours spent on her computer. He had tried to reach out to her, but she pushed him away with every attempt. What George didn't know was that while Clara sought excitement and validation from Thomas, he too had been hiding something from her. In the past few months, George had been working with a private investigator, hiring him not to spy on Clara, but to uncover a different truth, a truth about his own boss, a man named Richard who had been acting suspiciously in the office. George had caught wind of some troubling things: financial discrepancies, secretive meetings, and an odd pattern of behavior that didn't make sense. His gut told him something was off, and as it turned out, he was right. The investigator had uncovered more than he bargained for. Richard wasn't just involved in financial mismanagement. He had been engaging in illegal activities that could threaten the very foundation of the company George worked for. What George hadn't realized, however, was that Thomas, his wife's lover, was in on it too. They were all part of a larger conspiracy, one that threatened to unravel not just his family, but the entire business he had dedicated his life to. As George sat there, the pieces started to come together. The affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was part of a much bigger game, one that Clara had unwittingly become a part of. The video that had exposed her affair was not just a moment of infidelity. It was a strategic move. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been waiting for the perfect moment to use this information against them. George didn't know who had sent the video to him, but as he thought about the situation more, it became clear that this wasn't just about his marriage. This was about the future of everything he had worked for. His children, his career, his reputation, all of it was now at risk. The silence in the house was suffocating. Clara had never felt more exposed. The looks of disappointment, betrayal, and disgust from her children pierced through her like daggers. They had all been so innocent, so unaware. of the cracks in their family that had been slowly growing. Now, they were forced to confront the ugly truth, and Clara could see the deep impact it had on them. Lily, her eldest daughter, had always been her pride and joy. They had shared secrets, late-night talks, and a bond that Clara thought was unbreakable. But now Lily sat across from her, her face red from crying, her eyes hard with anger. "How could you?" Lily whispered, barely able to speak through her tears. "How could you do this to us? To Dad?" Clara's heart broke. She wanted to explain, to make Lily understand, but the words felt empty. What could she say? There was no justification for her actions. She had betrayed the trust of her children, and there was nothing she could do to take it back. Jake, their 18-year-old son, sat in the corner, staring at his phone, not wanting to make eye contact with anyone. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept his emotions to himself, but Clara could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He had grown up idolizing his father and had always looked to George as the example of what it meant to be a man. But now, George was sitting there in silence, devastated by the same betrayal. And Jake was struggling to reconcile the image of his mother with the woman he had just seen on that video. Sophie, the youngest at 14, didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. She knew her mom had done something wrong, but the emotional weight of it all was too much for her. She kept asking if everything would be okay, her innocent question hanging in the air, unanswered. Clara's mind raced as she saw the children's faces. She had always tried to protect them, to shield them from the harsh realities of the world. But now, she had thrown them into the middle of a storm they weren't prepared for. The betrayal was too much for them to bear. Clara felt herself becoming numb. There was no going back now. Her family, the life she had built, was crumbling before her eyes. But then a twist. George, who had been silent this whole time, stood up slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of quiet resolve. Clara couldn't read his expression. Anger, disappointment, hurt. All of it was there, but he was holding it back, trying to keep his composure for the sake of the children. "We'll deal with this," George said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But I won't let this destroy us completely. Not now, not for them." The words hit Clara harder than she could have imagined. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something she hadn't expected. He wasn't giving up on the family just yet. There was still a chance, however slim, to fix this. If only she could find a way to undo the damage. The air in the house felt thick with tension, and Clara couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of guilt that weighed on her chest. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, trapping her in the mess she had created. She had always prided herself on being a loving mother, a supportive wife. But now, everything she had built was teetering on the edge of collapse. After George's initial response, there was a brief, painful silence. Clara stood up, her hands trembling as she wiped the tears from her eyes. The cold stares of her children were too much to bear. She needed to say something, anything, to make them understand. She knew she had to make it right, or at least try. "I know I've betrayed all of you," Clara began, her voice shaking. "There's no excuse for what I did, and I know that I've hurt you. But please, just give me a chance to explain. I never meant for any of this to happen." Lily, the oldest, crossed her arms, her face hardening. "Explain? Explain what, Mom? How you slept with someone else behind Dad's back? How you destroyed everything we had? Clara's stomach churned. The words were like knives. But she had to keep going. She had to make them see that her actions weren't about them, not directly. I was lonely, Clara said softly, her voice cracking. I felt distant from your father, and I thought I was missing something. Something I didn't even realize I needed. Thomas. Thomas made me feel seen, like I mattered. It was a mistake, a huge mistake, and I don't know how to fix it, but I'm willing to try. I just need you to understand that. Jake finally looked up from his phone, his eyes dark with emotion. You think it's that easy? You think we'll just understand? You cheated on Dad. That's not something we can just forget. How could you do this to him? To us? The anger in Jake's voice was sharp, and Clara felt the sting of it deep inside. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to continue, no matter how much it hurt. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, her eyes full of regret. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm here. I'm still your mother. I want to make things right if you'll let me. Sophie, who had been quietly sitting in the corner, finally spoke. Mom, are you really sorry? Or are you just sorry because you got caught? Her voice was small, but it carried the weight of her hurt. Clara froze. Sophie's question hit harder than anything anyone else had said. Was she really sorry? Or was she just trying to save herself? Clara hadn't fully considered that until now. She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. She needed to find out if there was any way back for her family. George, who had been watching this exchange silently, finally stepped forward. Clara, he said quietly, I've been doing some thinking. The kids are right, but I'm not going to make any hasty decisions. I won't lie. I'm hurt and I'm angry, but I can't decide everything right now. We need time. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She wasn't going to force him to forgive her, but she needed him to at least consider it, for the sake of the children and their family. I'll give you the space you need, George, Clara said, her voice full of quiet desperation. But please, don't give up on us. The next few days were filled with a tense, almost unbearable silence. Clara had moved into a guest room, and George kept his distance, focusing on work and the kids. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a cold, empty shell. Clara had never felt so alone, not even after she'd made the decision to betray George in the first place. The children remained distant, their faces a mix of confusion and hurt. Lily stayed in her room most of the time, only leaving for school or to talk to her friends. Jake, usually the more level-headed one, had been spending his time at a friend's house, trying to avoid the chaos. Sophie, the youngest, was the only one who still tried to engage with Clara, though her attempts at normal conversation were awkward and laced with uncertainty. But Clara knew that the silence was the calm before the storm. It wasn't going to stay quiet for long. One evening, after dinner, George gathered the children in the living room. Clara hesitated before entering, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. This was the moment. The family had to face what was happening, and Clara had to face the consequences of her actions. I think we all know why we're here, George began, his voice steady but filled with sadness. Clara and I have talked. We've both had some time to think, and we've come to some decisions. But I need to hear from all of you. What do you want? How do we move forward from here?" Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had been dreading this moment, the moment when her children would decide her fate. The weight of their judgment was something she couldn't escape, no matter how much she wished she could. Lily, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom. I don't know if I even want to. You betrayed us. You betrayed Dad. I don't think I can trust you anymore." Jake sat next to Lily, his face a mask of frustration. "I don't know either," he said. "But I don't think we can just pretend everything is fine. You've hurt all of us, and I don't know if we can come back from this." Sophie, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly looked up. "What if you did? What if we could still be a family? What if you just tried, Mom?" Clara felt a surge of hope, but it was fleeting. Sophie was still young, still naive to the complexity of betrayal and the devastation it could cause. She wanted to believe that things could go back to how they were, but Clara knew deep down that this was no simple fix. George turned to Clara, his face hard. "We'll give it some time," he said. "But right now, I need space. We all need space. I'm not going to force anything. You've hurt this family too much, Clara. I'm not sure I can forgive you." Clara's heart sank. The words were harsh, but they were the truth. This wasn't just about her and George anymore. It was about the children and their future. Her betrayal had shattered the foundation of their family, and it was unclear if it could ever be rebuilt. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I'll give you all the space you need. I just want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." But Clara knew, deep down, that she was running out of time. If she didn't act soon, if she didn't find a way to regain their trust, the storm that had begun brewing would consume everything. There was no going back from this, no magic words to undo the damage. All she could do now was wait, and hope that, somehow, her family would find a way back to her. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself standing at a crossroads. The space that George had asked for had turned into a chasm. The children remained distant, their interactions, with her, cold and minimal. The family dinners, once a time for sharing laughter and stories, were now just silent meals where everyone kept to themselves. The house had never felt so empty. Clara had spent the last few weeks reflecting on her actions, her choices, and the impact they had on everyone she loved. She had tried to justify what she did, telling herself that her affair with Thomas was a mistake, a one-time slip into something she never expected. But the truth was far more painful. It wasn't just the affair. It was the years of neglect, of drifting apart from George, of ignoring the warning signs and failing to communicate. As much as Clara tried to fix things, she knew that it wasn't enough. The hurt ran too deep. She had broken the trust of her family, and no amount of apologies or promises could erase the damage she had done. Even Sophie, who had once clung to the hope that everything could be mended, now avoided her. Clara walked into the living room one evening, her heart heavy. George was sitting on the couch, and the children were scattered around the room. The air was thick with tension, but Clara had reached her limit. She knew what she had to do. "I've been thinking," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this, but I do know that I've failed as a wife and mother. I've hurt you all too much, and I don't expect your forgiveness. but I want you to know that I am sorry. I'll always be sorry. George didn't respond immediately, but Clara could see the flicker of pain in his eyes. It was a look that haunted her, and one she knew would never leave her. He had tried. He had given her the space she needed, but it was clear that no amount of time would ever repair what had been broken. Lily was the first to speak. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom. I don't even know if I want to. Her voice cracked, but there was no malice, just pure sadness. You've hurt us all, and I don't think it's something we can just forget. Clara felt the weight of her daughter's words, and her heart shattered all over again. But deep down, she knew it was the truth. There was no going back from this. The pain she had caused was irreversible. Jake stood up, his face cold. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You've destroyed our family, and now we have to live with the consequences. He looked at his siblings, then back at Clara. But I don't think I can keep pretending things are fine. Sophie, who had been sitting quietly, stood up and walked over to Clara. I just want everything to be okay again, she said softly, her eyes filled with tears. But I know it's not going to be. I know things will never be the same. Clara hugged Sophie tightly, the weight of her child's sadness pressing down on her. She had failed them all, and now there was no undoing the harm. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the loss of family, the betrayal of trust, and the destruction of everything that had once been a safe haven for them. I understand, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what. George, who had been silent up until now, stood up slowly. His voice was quiet, but firm. I'm done, Clara. This marriage is over. I can't keep going like this, pretending everything's okay. I need to move on. Clara's heart sank, but she knew it was inevitable. This was the end. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. Their family, once whole, was now broken. And it was her fault. She left the room, tears streaming down her face, knowing that she would never be the same again. As she walked to the door, she looked back at her children, her once perfect family, and realized that her world, the life she had built, had crumbled because of her choices. But even in the devastation, there was a glimmer of truth. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, and that the consequences of betrayal were far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. Clara left the house that night, not knowing what the future held, but understanding that her life would never be the same. And though she would carry the weight of her mistakes forever, she knew that she had to face them, no matter how much it hurt.